I call the honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. At this late hour, 100 yards to our west, over in the Senate, the carbon tax is going through its final death throes, with the Labor Party and the Greens lining up to vote against the repeal for no less, Deputy Speaker, than the 6th time. 3 times in this House of Representatives and 3 times over in the Senate. So, Deputy Speaker, the landscape is clear. As sure as night follows day, should the Labor Party and the Greens ever come back to office in this country, they would introduce a carbon tax. They might give it another name, Deputy Speaker, but a carbon tax, a carbon price, call it whatever you want, Labor and the Greens will introduce it. Now, Deputy Speaker, during the debate on the carbon tax, we hear many members of the Greens and the Labor Party taking the high moral ground, claiming that they are the ones taking action on climate change. Well, Deputy Speaker, the question that they never answer is what effect will that action actually have on what they are trying to achieve, and that is change global temperatures. Now, Deputy Speaker, I would like to go through the science and the maths to show what actually taking action means. Firstly, Deputy Speaker, we know Australia emits around 1.2% of the world's man-made emissions of carbon dioxide. And we know, Deputy Speaker, at best, at very best, the carbon tax would reduce about 5% of Australia's predicted CO2 emissions from man-made sources. In fact, Deputy Speaker, using the government's own numbers, those emissions actually increase. It's only when they go into the nonsense of carbon credits and buying carbon credits from Botswana and other places there's actually a reduction. But Australia's emissions, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, they will reduce 5%. So therefore, the carbon tax would abate 5% by 1.2%. So the reduction that we will make here in Australia with this wonderful carbon tax will be 0.06% of the world's emissions. Now, Deputy Speaker, currently we know that the global concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 390 parts per million. And we know, Deputy Speaker, that that will rise over the next 15 years at around about 2 parts per million. Because we know countries like India and China and the rest of the world will continue to use fossil fuels to lift millions, Deputy Speaker, tens of millions, hundreds of millions out of people to give them economic opportunity, to give them the ability for education and for health. So, Deputy Speaker, we're looking at around about a 30 parts per million increase over the next 15 years. So therefore, by 2030, the carbon tax would abate 0.06 of 30 parts per million. So we come back, Deputy Speaker, to 0.018 of 1 part per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that the carbon tax will abate. 0.018 of 1 part per million. Now, Deputy Speaker, if we look at that on the overall levels, by 2030 we would be somewhere around about 420 parts per million. With the carbon tax, we'll be around about 419.982 parts per million, with that massive saving of 0.018. So how much warming will this avoid, Deputy Speaker? Because that must be the ultimate aim of the carbon tax. Now, if we go with the IPCC's prediction of 3 degrees of warming over the next century, we come up with what the carbon tax would save by 2030, Deputy Speaker, and bear with me so I make sure I get all the decimal points right. We would save 0.00075 of 1 degree by 2030. In a fraction, Deputy Speaker, that is 1/13,000th of 1 degree. Here's the real kicker. The most accurately we can measure temperatures is to 0.05, 1/20th of 1 degree. But the carbon tax, it's actually 660 times smaller saving in global temperatures than what we can actually measure, Deputy Speaker. If someone came to you and said they were going to take $550 from every family every year for the purpose of taking action, Deputy Speaker, of reducing 1/13,000th of 1 degree of temperature, 660 times smaller than we can measure. You'd think insanity has taken over. But that is what the Labor and the Greens are going to the next election with.